This video is on the themes in chapter 3 of Mice and Men. Steinbeck doesn't mess around. After introducing everyone in chapter 2, he's straight into the dramatic action, and chapter 3 ends with the fight between Curly and Lenny, which is the major event in the first half of the novel. We're going to talk in this video about 5 key themes, and those key themes are loneliness and friendship, tragic inevitability, gender discrimination, the American dream, and survival of the fittest. Now, we've already talked in some of our other videos about the importance of companionship in this novel and the significance of loneliness in contrast to that. And that becomes even more apparent at the start of chapter 3, which begins with Slim and George sitting down at the card table opposite each other in this sign that they're starting to form a bond. And they're having an open and an honest conversation, which again is a positive sign of the bond they're forming. And it's really, again, this opportunity for George to open up a bit to Slim and to tell Slim some of the secrets he's kept from other characters, which really, again, shows the value of people being friends. And they even talk about the importance of friendship. George says, "I've seen the guys that go around on the ranches alone. That ain't no good. They don't have no fun. After a long time, they get mean. They get wanting to fight all the time." "Yeah, they get mean," Slim agreed. "They get so they don't want to talk to nobody." There you go. So this is in the context of George saying, well, Lenny's a damn nuisance to travel around with, but actually it's better than not being with anybody. And we see that time and again in the novel. I mean, Curly, there's an example of a man who clearly is lonely. He's looking for his wife, but he's never with her in the novel. And there he is, lonely and mean. Later on in the novel, we'll meet Crooks. He's extremely lonely. He's not even allowed to live with the other men. And again, he's quite mean to Lenny. So George and Lenny stand in stark contrast to the loneliness that can happen to migrant workers who travel around solo. We see a strong example of the importance of companionship in Candy and his dog. Candy goes everywhere with his dog, and when it gets shot later in this chapter, he turns away from the room and faces the wall in a symbol of his isolation at having lost his best friend. Later in the chapter, he turns back towards the room when he hears George and Lenny discussing their possibility of getting a ranch. The feeling of friendship and companionship in the ranch brings Candy back towards life again after losing his dog. So it's so important, this idea of having companions around you. Tragic inevitability. Steinbeck never lets this idea stand still. He introduces the characters in chapter 2. By the end of chapter 3, we've already had a massive fight. The tension is building throughout. And even from the start of chapter 3, we can see the direction things are going if we pay attention. So the beginning of the chapter has George telling Slim about what really happened in Weed. And we find out that Lenny held on to a girl and that the girl was wearing a red dress. That rings massive alarm bells in the reader's mind because we've just been introduced to Curly's wife in chapter 2 and she was also wearing red. Put red and red together and you can see where we're going. He's seen this girl in a red dress. Dumb bastard like he is, he wants to touch everything he likes, just wants to feel it. So he reaches out to feel this red dress and the girl lets out a squawk and that gets Lenny all mixed up and he holds on because the only thing he can think to do. Lenny gets into trouble with a girl dressed in red and a lynch mob goes out looking for him. Lynch mobs in those times were common. Mob justice would often be doled out to people who were accused of rape. A bit later in the chapter, Whit and George are talking together and the idea that there's going to be trouble with Curly's wife is built up further. George said, "She's going to make a mess. There's going to be a bad mess about her. She's a jailbait all set on the trigger. That Curly got his work cut out for him." They're talking about what's coming. They can see it a mile away and the reader starts to see it as well. And sure enough, by the end of the chapter, trouble has already come about as an indirect result of Curly's wife. She actually hasn't done anything, but the men due to Curly's sexual jealousy, have had a fight over her. So she really is a problem, and we sense that this climax, the first climax of the novel at the end of chapter 3, won't be the last moment of trouble in the novel. In fact, with Lenny grabbing Curly's hand and crippling him, really, you can see that it's not going to end well for Lenny, can't you? I mean, he's never going to get away with that, especially with the kind of mind he's got. In the Aristotelian sense, and we've been talking about the Aristotelian sense of tragedy, we can see this event as the peripeteia, or the turning point. Something happens, and after that, the rest of the tragedy is inevitable. And sure enough, that's how it starts to look when Lenny crushes Curly's hand. Although nothing happens to him immediately, we're thinking, this is not over yet. This is only just beginning. And while we're talking about Curly's wife, let's just spend a moment thinking about the gender double standards that we noticed in chapter 2, but which come through really strongly here. So there they are, critiquing Curly's wife and saying what trouble she's going to be. But immediately after, Whit and George start talking about prostitutes and how a good way to relax in this town is to go out and have a fun time with the prostitutes. Whit, in fact, tells George about Susie's place, which is a place where you can sit and just have a drink of whiskey, or you can have a sexual encounter with a prostitute, and that it's much better than Clara's place, the other brothel, where you might get syphilis. There's more judgment of women. The women in this chapter don't talk at all, none of them. They get judged constantly. Even the brothel owners, Susie and Clara, are getting judged by the men. Whilst Curly's wife is someone who's going to lead to trouble, it's absolutely fine for the men to go out and have a flop, as they call it. What an incredible double standard is going on in this world they live in. Now, another theme which we already met at the start of the novel, way back in chapter 1, but which starts to get much stronger here, is this idea of the American dream. That is the dream that anyone can come to live in America and achieve financial and material success if they are willing to put in the work. It doesn't matter what their background is. Well, these migrant workers think they can have a piece of that American dream themselves, and it's very clear that this is really important to George. At the start of the chapter, he starts telling Slim in this confession of his, if I was bright, if I was even a little bit smart, I'd have my own little place and I'd be bringing in my own crops instead of doing all the work and not getting what comes up out of the ground. And later on, he manages to talk a bit more about this with Whit. When they're talking about visiting the prostitutes, George says, me and Lenny's rolling up a steak. I might go in and set and have a shot, but I ain't putting out no 2.5. So he's not going to spend money on sex with a prostitute because he wants to save up his money. And then later in the chapter again, we can see that there might be trouble between Curly and Slim, and George, he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. Why? I'm staying right here. I don't want to get mixed up in nothing. Lenny and me got to make a stake. He wants to make a stake. That means he wants to get some savings together so that he can get out of this life. So George is turning into this representative of the migrant worker who wants desperately to get out of these poor living conditions and to set themselves up on their own ranch. And in fact, this is what he and Lenny talk about when everyone else except Candy, has left the bunkhouse. They start getting into their conversation about their dream, as they did in the first chapter. But this time round, there's a difference. In the first chapter, George was treating it in a kind of dismissive way and kind of laughing and mocking the dream. But in this chapter, George starts describing it in more detail and becomes entranced with his vision. He starts talking about exactly what they're going to have on their own ranch. Well, it's 10 acres, said George. Got a little windmill, got a little shack on it, and a chicken run. This really sounds quite real, doesn't it? As if it's not just a dream, but a place that actually exists. And he goes on. Got a kitchen, orchard, cherries, apples, peaches, carrots, nuts. Got a few berries. There's a place for alfalfa, plenty of water to flog it. There's a pig pen. His voice was growing warmer. Could have a few pigs. I could build a smokehouse like the one Grandpa had. And when we kill a pig, we can smoke the bacon and the hams and make sausage and all like that. There's real substance to this vision here. And apart from substance, there's also this concept of subsistence, which means farming for yourself, not farming to sell to anyone else, but looking after yourself. That's why he's talking about killing the pigs, smoking the bacon and the hams, making sausages, having the fruit, the tomatoes, the chickens, the rabbits. He's talking about subsistence farming. He's really linking into this idea, which we've mentioned before, about rugged individualism, the phrase used widely by the Republican president Herbert Hoover, who was president from 1929 to 1933. He talked about how individuals needed not to rely on the state, but go out and make a life for themselves. Rugged individualism was the belief that all individuals can succeed on their own and that government help for people should be minimal. Of course, he was pushing this agenda because America was in a depression. There wasn't enough state support to go around. So this was a kind of message that was being put out there about how people should be looking after themselves. And George buys into that idea, doesn't he? We can be subsistence farmers. We can look out for ourselves. We can be rugged individualists. In fact, George really starts to get into this idea of their dream. And at one point, he sits there entranced, which means he has really put himself under his own spell. And not just himself, but Candy as well. That's the moment when Candy turns around back into the room and says, hey, I want to be a part of this. He got actually some state support and he got $250 for losing his hand. And he's got some money in the bank and they start counting up and they start thinking, hang on, this could really happen. And this is a moment in the novel when the American dream starts to feel like it could become a reality. It's very powerful for them when they start talking about it in financial terms. George says, hang on a minute, Lenny and I could get our stake together from this month's work. That'd be $450. I bet we could swing her for that. Then you and Lenny could go get a start and I'd get a job and make up the rest. They fell into a silence. They looked at one another amazed. This thing they had never really believed in was coming true. George said reverently, Jesus Christ, I bet we could swing her. His eyes were full of wonder. I bet we could swing her, he repeated softly. This is a magical moment, a spiritual moment for them. Wonder, amazement. Jesus Christ is used as an expletive here, but in fact, this is really George's way of having some kind of spiritual realization. So it's a very powerful moment for them. Nobody could can us. If we don't like a guy, we can say, get the hell out, and by God, he's got to do it. And if a friend come along, why, we'd have an extra bunk, and we'd say, why don't you spend the night? And by God, he would. It's not just about financial freedom, about independence, about living for themselves. It's also about having the right people around them. So they get very excited about that idea of it as well. It's a financial and a social utopia for them. And when the other men come back in, just before they come back in to the bunkhouse, George says, let's keep it a secret. Don't tell nobody about it, just us three and nobody else. They're liable to can us, so we can't make no stake. Just go on like we was going to buck barley the rest of our lives. Then all of a sudden, someday we'll go and get our pay and scram out of here. They were grinning with delight. Very exciting for them. It's a little secret. Even that is part of their camaraderie, part of this dream coming true, this fellow feeling, these three men who've been oppressed by the situation they're in, thinking, yes, we can get out of it. But of course, Steinbeck doesn't appear to believe that this dream can really come true. And he rapidly shuts it down with the violent aggression of the fight at the end of the chapter. Structurally, it's incredibly significant that Steinbeck puts this fight in just after they've been talking about the American dream, how it's going to come true for them. Yeah, we can make it happen. But boom, in comes Curly, in comes the male aggression, and in comes the end of the dream. Well, at the end of the chapter, Lenny's saying, well, I still got to tend the rabbits. And George says, yeah, of course you will. But what he's really asking, and what the reader is really asking, is, Can this American dream still really come true? And the answer to the reader is not as clear and as positive as the answer that George gives Lenny. This is Steinbeck showing how the best laid plans of mice and men gang oft agley. So he named this novel of Mice and Men after a poem written by Robbie Burns, the Scottish poet, in which he talks about a mouse who had built a little nest in the long grass, and along comes the farmer and he hoes up the grass and he destroys the mouse's nest. The moral of the story is that the best laid plans of mice who've built a little home in the grass, and men, because he makes an implicit comparison between mice and humans, gang oft agley. Gang oft agley means often go wrong. You can't make it happen. When you try to get some kind of little nest together, it will get ripped apart by the violence of some uncaring superior force that destroys everything. In the poem, it's ripped apart by a plough that turns up the mouse's nest. In this novel, the idea of the dream, the American dream, is ripped up by male violence. Against all of this, there is a version of the American dream which is a kind of more obviously fantastical version of the dream, which the ranch workers do get to enjoy. There's a bit near the beginning of the chapter where a character called Whit is really excited and he takes down one of his Western magazines from his apple box. We've been told about those Western magazines in chapter 2. These are magazines that the men get really excited about. And he's like, look at this. And there's a letter in the magazine. It's a letter by this old farm worker who used to work with them called Bill Tenner. And Whit is incredibly excited that this guy he used to know has got his name in the magazine. I think that shows you that these men are kind of desperate for just something beyond their miserable little migrant worker lives. And so there's a kind of vicarious enjoyment of Bill Tenner's success in getting his name into the magazine. That's kind of a mini version of the American dream. Oh my goodness, he's become famous. He's got his name in the magazine. And it's also, interestingly, quite exciting for Whit because Whit knows this guy and is reminded of this guy who he says was a hell of a nice fella. So the fact that he can be put back in touch, even if it's only via the magazine, with this guy who he really liked, provides that sense of companionship that he was missing. So that's a way in which the dream can come true. You can see your friend's name in print, you can get excited, you can say, oh, he's almost famous, and oh, he was a nice guy and he's my friend. That's a kind of small-scale way in which the dream can come true. But the only really realistic way of escaping from what they're in is what Whit says. It's by going to visit the prostitutes. Because after all, as Whit says, well, a guy gotta have some fun sometime. And he says that directly after George has said, me and Lenny's rolling up a steak. I might go in and set and have a shot, but I ain't putting out no 2.5. George is talking about his dream, and Whit very realistically says, well, you've got to have fun sometime. That's the realistic approach to the life they're in. You know, you want an escape? Go and get a whiskey, go and have a flop with somebody in Susie's place. That's really what's on offer. The final big idea in this chapter is connected to our old friend Charles Darwin and the survival of the fittest. In this animal world, only the ones who are the strongest, the physically fittest, can survive at this point in the novel. To go hand in hand with that, there's also quite a lot of conversation developing about how if you're not fit enough anymore, then really you should be killed off. That was talked about in chapter 2. Slim, in fact, killed off the 4 small puppies. They weren't big enough to survive. And it comes back strongly here in the episode about killing off Candy's old dog. Now, Carlson is the one who wants to get rid of the dog. And he talks about how what you need to do with someone who's not physically fit anymore is what we would call a mercy killing. So a mercy killing, or you might know the phrase euthanasia, which is a similar phrase but not identical, means ending someone's suffering by ending their life and doing it in a way so that they won't suffer whilst it's happening. So Carlson comes up with this idea, we've got to get rid of Candy's dog. It's so smelly, it can't even see, it can hardly eat. So what I'll do, he says to Candy, or what you should do, is shoot it in the back of the head. If you shoot it in the back of the head, it won't feel anything. It won't know it's happened. The readers, we do view Carlson as being quite a brutal character, and really he doesn't have much empathy for Candy as he's talking about this. Candy looks terribly unhappy about the whole idea, but Carlson just kind of bulldozes on with what he's saying. But in fact, there's something merciful in Carlson because he is pointing out the way to do this deed without the dog feeling any pain. And in fact, when Candy can't bring himself to do it, Carlson goes off and performs that action for him. Now, Carlson's not the only one saying this. Slim, in fact, also says, "Carl's right, Candy. That dog ain't no good to himself. I wish somebody'd shoot me if I got old and a cripple." Slim's word is law, isn't it? In fact, it says that just afterwards. But Slim's opinions were law. And they're not just law for the people on the ranch, but also they are taking on a heavy weight amongst the readers who really look to Slim for guidance about how to behave in this kind of a world. So when Slim says that, we think, okay, yeah, he's probably right. And Candy himself later on says, "When they carry me here, I wish somebody'd shoot me." So there you go. You've got Carlson saying, let's kill off anyone who's not strong enough. You've got Slim saying, I'd want the same to happen to me. You've got Candy saying the same thing. It's all part of Steinbeck's foreshadowing for later in the novel. But for now, let's just point out the importance of a mercy killing. Equally importantly and significantly, Candy isn't able to perform the mercy killing of his own dog, and Carlson does it for him. And Candy spends most of the chapter staring at the wall. Late in the chapter, he's got some sense of life back in him because he's been discussing the dream with George and Lenny. But he reflects and he says to George, "George, huh? I'd have shot that dog myself, George. I should not have let no stranger shoot my dog." A really important line there from Candy. He recognises that he should have taken the responsibility for the killing of his own best friend, his dog. And he's really sad that he wasn't able to do that. And those words stick with George, I think, because of what George will do at the end of the novel. So just notice that here and make a note of it. Apart from this idea of mercy killing, we really see this idea of the survival of the fittest at its strongest in the fight between Curly and Lenny at the end of the chapter. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we look at the characters in this chapter. But really, it is an animal fight, and the strongest one wins, and the weaker one, Curly, ends up crippled, turning into a new sort of Candy figure. So Steinbeck shows you, look, this is a world of brutality, and it is a world of survival of the fittest. And he shockingly shows us that in the way this fight takes place. I hope you like this video. I'm enjoying making these videos. I love this book. I hope you're enjoying it too. And show me you're enjoying it by giving me a like. And that will help me to get my material to more people, and subscribe to my channel so you can find out when I've posted the next video, which is on the characters in chapter 3.